Now, don't panic. This isn't a Sony camera. It's not the FX3, it's not the FX30, but it's the brand new Blackmagic Full Frame 6K camera. It has a lot of names. Now, Blackmagic sent me this camera to try out and to use in some future projects. And although this is priced relative to a lot of mirrorless cameras on the market, this camera, albeit its size and shape, isn't necessarily a mirrorless camera. But we'll get into all of this. Now, I'm not necessarily gonna call this review in more of a first impressions video. Blackmagic actually sent me this camera just before I went to Ghana, and I didn't really have a big plan for it. I wasn't gonna shoot a bunch of projects with this guy, mostly because I brought other cameras, and for the most part, I shot this on a 16mm DZO lens just to see what the image quality was like, but also give my feedback on using the camera in general. Now, the Blackmagic 6K does have the brand new full frame L mount. That won't open. It has this guy. It has a brand new L mount sensor that's gonna be on here, which is a little bit novel for myself because it's the first L mount camera that I've actually owned. I've used a Panasonic S5 II twice. It wasn't my cup of tea, but also I don't have L mount lenses, so I did use an adapter, and I also used a combination of the DZO Vespa Prime 16mm and a bunch of vintage iron glass lenses that I'll talk about in a different video. Now, I do love that this thing does have things like false color already built in. You could build in LUTs into your camera as well, which it did on the Pocket system before it got to the Sonys. You have a bunch of your cinema features that you can use inside of the camera, and you could use a big bright screen, which just looks really nice. Like Blackmagic, you guys made an amazing screen on the back of this camera. If you only made a body design that was a little more cube shaped, we'd be laughing right now. However, you can use all the features that you would see on a regular cinema camera that's priced a little bit higher on a camera body that's a lot more affordable. It also has adapted its memory to the new CF Express Type B, which I use with my Red Komodo X, which means I don't need a third set of memory cards in order to get this thing working. You're also gonna get a lot of the I/O that you would expect from a cinema camera, but there's a couple of nuances. You're still gonna be able to have a headphone jack and a 3.5mm jack and two XLR ports, although the two XLR ports, you kind of need this little mini XLR to a regular one in order for you to get the shotgun mics and the lavalier mics that you want to use. You're also going to get a full-size HDMI, but you won't get SDI, which kind of makes a little bit of sense given the camera's size, and that's more than fine with me in terms of the price point. You're also going to get a USB-C that's on here as well because you can record to an SSD drive, which is something that a lot of cinema cameras just can't do. Now, this makes it easy, especially if you're doing DIT on your own, where you don't have to actually back up your memory card onto a hard drive or onto a computer. You can just take the hard drive out, put it onto something like a RAID, or you could actually start doing your dailies right there on that hard drive. So that is actually kind of nice. Another thing about this body is I like how simple it is. It's not riddled with a bunch of custom buttons that you're gonna have to sit down for a day and really start to flesh out. It has two recording buttons, and I have a little array of buttons at the top where I could set up 3 custom functions, which I usually just use for my false colors, turning on and off my LUT, and turning on and off my focus peaking. Also, the buttons on the back are pretty easy and self-explanatory to figure out, making this, honestly, in terms of its use from a body design, actually incredibly easy. But we're gonna address the elephant in the room, and the fact that we all kind of wanted a cube camera, and the fact that they came out with this guy, which kind of just looks like the Pocket line, that might have left myself and a bunch of other people a little bit frustrated. Now, one thing about the body that I do kind of like is the fact that I have gigantic hands. I do mention a lot that these guys are kind of like tennis rackets, but this is one of the few cameras where my hand actually fits entirely on the grip. Now, I might be sipping a little bit of copium in order for me to actually like the camera body design, but I will say out of most cameras, especially my Sony ones, it's not really necessarily conducive for my hand gripping, and I usually have to add something else in order for me to still have a pocket-sized camera and not fall out of my hand while I'm using it. Now, we're gonna get into the image quality side of things, but there is one thing we're gonna talk about, and it's actually the back of this camera. Not necessarily the screen. I mentioned it's already really nice, but this has one of the best menu systems that you could find on a cinema camera. With the Blackmagic system, and I actually had the Pocket 4K some years ago, it's the easiest to start to figure out. Once you press the menu settings, everything is in a very logical place, and everything's incredibly straightforward. You can set up things like your frame rates, or whether or not you want to change the color of your focus peaking, or what mode you want to shoot at between the open gate or the anamorphic modes without having to sift through different menus. Now, it helps that the screen is really big and it's easy to find things, but it's also really nice that everything is essentially laid out in a way that makes sense. One thing that I kind of get a little bit annoyed about with my Sony cameras, even some of the newer ones, is that if I have to find a particular setting, I'm sifting through different menus to figure out where the focus breathing compensation is or something. But with the Blackmagic 6K, I just open up the menu, it has a big bright screen, and then I could just move through some of the pages, which means it's easy to find the options that I'm looking for, and they're all right in front of me without me scratching my head figuring out how to work this thing. Now, I'm gonna make a pretty bold statement. The Blackmagic 6K full frame in terms of image quality is the best in its price point. In fact, I'd go as far as to say right up until like almost a red Komodo, I think on straight up image quality, the Blackmagic 6K is right up there with them. Now, of course, you're gonna have to make different sacrifices with the body and the design of the camera itself. If you're gonna stare at the spec sheet, you might not think that there's much going on here. In fact, you actually might think it's really similar to the Panasonic cameras that are available. The Blackmagic 6K, albeit has some body issues, does produce a really good image, and it does shoot things in 6K open gate, which a lot of people found was an attractive feature. Now, at first I thought 6K open gate was a gimmick, but one of the jobs that I find myself doing the most is honestly sit down talking head Facebook and Google ads. Now, for the majority of the time I have to shoot for 16:9 and 9:16 at the same time, which isn't the most feasible thing in the world all of the time. Cutting down from a horizontal image into a vertical one, or trying to make a vertical image horizontal, which is way worse. It actually doesn't become the most conducive thing in the world, and it becomes quite frustrating, especially if you have to repurpose content. But with the Blackmagic 6K, you could shoot in open gate, so you have a little bit more flexibility because you're not shooting in a 16:9, you're actually shooting at a more squared aspect ratio, which means you could cut it either way. On top of that, you could actually set the Blackmagic 6K to a vertical configuration, and all of your menu systems are going to move with it. So if you're someone that is a vertical first creator, you can still shoot vertical open gate and not have to cock your head to the side just to make sure you have access to all your menus and your settings. Now, in terms of the color science coming from the Blackmagic 6K, it looks great. You're gonna have a dual native ISO at 400 and 3200, I believe. And when I'm using 400, which is the majority of when I'm gonna use this camera, when I'm shooting in daylight and high sun and I'm working with darker skin tones, looks really good. There's nothing much I could say about it. You're gonna get that 12-bit B-RAW that's gonna come out of camera, and honestly, it's actually incredibly easy to grade as well. What's nice about any Blackmagic camera is that you do have a free license to DaVinci Resolve, which is one of the most powerful editing softwares you could use in terms of color grading. It also works really well with Blackmagic footage, and that's just a slight coincidence. However, I actually just use some of the built-in looks that you can get from DaVinci Resolve while getting that free membership, and I'm able to actually dial in an image and have more of a film look built right into DaVinci Resolve itself. Now, if you guys do want to see a separate video about editing B-RAW clips, particularly the ones in this video, leave a comment down below. A sidebar is what's cool about Blackmagic sending me this camera is that they didn't really ask me to do anything. They kind of just sent me the camera, said make some cool stuff, and now you're gonna get a bunch of really cool videos in exchange because you didn't really hold me down to making anything, which means I'm gonna probably make everything. Which is also a great reason to subscribe to this channel because most of you guys actually aren't, although you keep coming back and watching videos. It's a free thing to do and it makes me happy, so subscribe and we'll just keep moving on with the rest of this video. Now, there's also 3 more things about this camera that a lot of people ask about, but it's also not the strongest points of the Blackmagic 6K. Now, if you are shooting in 6K, which I don't know why you wouldn't, you only get a limited amount of different frame rates without cropping in on the sensor. If you want to shoot an open gate, you're only going to get 36 frames a second, which is like 1.5 times speed, which it works. It's just not the slowest thing in the world. So if you're looking for that, you might be a little bit disappointed. Now, if you want to jump up into 48 frames a second, you are going to go to 6K DCI, which isn't the slowest thing in the world. However, if you're somebody that's looking for a camera that does that, truthfully, we'll just get another camera, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, the second thing we're gonna be talking about is going to be the rolling shutter. Now, when I wrap everything up into a bow and I talk about who I think this camera is gonna be for, rolling shutter is something that might get on people's nerves. Also, it might be just a thing that suddenly people wanted to be upset about now that cameras like the A9 III have it and the Red Komodo have it. Now, what happens with rolling shutter is the fact that the image doesn't get read out all at the same time. It's kind of like if I was to say a sentence, one word at a time, but I said it a little bit faster not to get on everybody's nerves, and at the same time I just spat out what I wanted to say, which generally I do most of the time and everyone yells that I'm too fast. Now, with the rolling shutter that's on the Blackmagic 6K, it's not the greatest in the world. In fact, you're gonna see those artifacts if you're whipping the camera back and forth. And if you're shooting sports, it might not be the best optimal choice for you. This, again, is going to go into who I think this camera is for. And it's gonna go even more so when I talk about the dual native ISO and its low light capabilities. Now, the Blackmagic 6K does have a dual native ISO. It has 400 and 3200. Now, my experience using some of the Sony cameras, even when you go to your high base ISO, it's not the cleanest image in the world. Now, when using the Blackmagic 6K in terms of its low light capabilities, it definitely works. It's definitely a full frame sensor, but in terms of something compared to like the Sony FX3, it's not going to stack up, and I think that's entirely fine. And the reason why I think that's fine is because I actually took a deeper dive into finding out who this camera might actually be for. Now, in terms of thinking about who this camera is for, the Blackmagic 6K doesn't cost the most in the world. It's under $3,000, which also puts it in the same line as cameras like the A7C Mark II that I'm shooting on right now, or other Sony cameras that are available, or other Canon cameras, or even some Panasonic bodies as well. And what ends up happening is that you judge all of the cameras by the same metrics because they're in the same price points. I'm gonna say this and it's gonna be a bold statement. I don't think that the Blackmagic 6K is a run and gun, I'm not sure what I'm doing, but I'm gonna show up and shoot anyways type of camera. Now, it's shaped to it. If you wanna put a camera strap on this guy, throw on a lens, and throw on the extra battery pack that you can get on this guy to give it longer battery life, you could absolutely go ahead and you can do that. However, I think this is a camera where if you are starting into the more narrative or more shots that are going to be a little bit more composed and slower paced, I think this camera is perfect. The image quality that you're gonna get at 6K, either in the open gate or in the DCI, is gonna look amazing. It's gonna look better than a lot of the cameras in the same price range. Now, not having the best rolling shutter in the world is a little bit of a bummer, but if you put this camera on sticks and you're shooting on the daytime or in controlled environments, you can leverage that lower 400 ISO, still get amazing image quality, still get great colors, still get the B-roll that comes out of it, but at the same time, if you're shooting things like interviews for documentaries or corporate work or things where the camera's not getting swung around too much, how detrimental is rolling shutter then at that point anyways? If I'm sitting there talking face to face with somebody for a corporate interview, which is the vast majority of a lot of people's jobs, or things that your camera's gonna be on sticks and not moving, I don't necessarily need it to have global shutter. And that's coming from somebody who owns a Red Komodo X. Now, on the flip side, with its low light capabilities, the easiest way to mitigate some of those things is actually just using a lower ISO and lighting your scenes, which I've mentioned in this video over here, but at the same time is just being aware of that weakness and just using it to its strengths. A big thing with the Blackmagic 6K kind of being the first of its configuration with the new L mount is you might want to just take consideration in terms of what it can do really well and then just don't do the things that it doesn't. Now, in terms of an end-all be-all, if I was to only have one camera, would I go with the 6K full frame? For my style of shooting, maybe not, because I shoot a lot of things that are moving around, like sports and different things that I might need something with a faster readout. However, if you're someone that doesn't shoot that stuff, which a lot of people aren't, I think this is gonna do just fine. In fact, I'm gonna make an entire video about the rolling shutter and really start to dive in of whether or not you can use this for motion. I would have done it while I was in Ghana, but I just got drunk every single day, which is not my fault. I deserve a vacation. But that being said, those are my first impressions of the Blackmagic 6K full frame. It's a great camera, has a ton of good image quality. You have a bunch of different modes that are flexible. B-raw is always really nice, and also getting a free DaVinci Resolve is kind of cool as well. Now, if you guys want to see more videos about this guy, because this is going to be the first of I have 10 videos planned on this camera, which I'm gonna dive a little bit deeper into some of the nitty gritty and also to flesh out some of the things that I didn't get to in this video. That being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, or at the very least you learned a thing or two, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.